Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would answer kind of one of the questions that I've gotten. And people need to understand that when we're dealing with stuff from some of the best coaches in the world, they oftentimes have methods that work and still allow their people to be the best of the best that aren't necessarily based off of the real science. And in other words, they'll say things that actually are later proven to be untrue, but it still doesn't interfere with the results of their athletes because there's other reasons for the success of what they're doing. And I think a perfect example here, because I've heard people say, Jason, you're a big fan of Louie Simmons. You consider him to be one of the greatest coaches of all time. And I actually do. Easily one of the greatest strength coaches, again, of all time. Nothing but respect for the man. But they're like, you don't seem to agree with the idea that he's put out that testosterone drops after an hour of training, so you need to limit sessions to like an hour, and then he has people go do other sessions later in the day, so they split stuff up. And the same thing, that cortisol goes up, and I've had people say, well, isn't that a bad thing? Don't we want to minimize cortisol from training? Okay, and Louie was saying that for years before this was actually fully studied under laboratory conditions and meta-analysis. So we need to understand that he's saying that as far as the hormones go based upon very old preliminary research, because he's been in the game a very, very long time. And when you're making statements 10 or 12 years before a meta-analysis is done, you obviously can't predict the future of science. Okay, the guy might be a mad scientist and a genius, but he can't predict the future. He doesn't have magical abilities. So, you can't hold that against somebody. You really and truly cannot. And I'll jump into in a minute of what the actual research has shown on this regarding training response and hypertrophy and everything else as far as hormone release from training. It's the opposite of what people used to think it was, once it's actually really been looked at closely. But what you need to factor in is that, yeah, he has his guys train super hard for an hour. Anyone who's done true speed work knows speed work is hard. If you think speed work is easy, for example, your dynamic effort days, you clearly are not doing it correctly. You are clearly not doing it correctly. All right, same thing with the max effort days. They're coming in and they're hitting a true 1 rep max and then banging out a lot of assistance work immediately after. But what you need to keep in mind is that he splits his guys up, so they end up getting a break because, again, he'll cut people off at an hour. They're coming back and doing second workouts with a bunch of training volume. So he might have his guys do the really heavy work and then a bunch of assistance work and cram as much hard ass-busting work in as you can in an hour and then get them out. Okay, that's not a bad thing. That will totally work, and it obviously works. But then, because was worried about the hormone stuff, he has them come back and do more volume later. And again, their secondary workouts they're doing are sometimes just as hard as some people's normal workouts, like your full main session. Look at some of the stuff they're doing. Come in and be hundreds of reps on various supplemental lifts. Okay, taken to failure. So it's a little bit different than what people are thinking. It's not, oh, coming in and training really easy for an hour. No, he's killing those guys in that hour, and then they're waiting a couple hours, few hours, and coming back for a PM workout to get the rest of the training volume in. So let's look at the actual hormone stuff, because that's just simply not true. Let me rephrase that. It's true, but it's irrelevant. Because we're standing here worried about transient fluctuations in anabolic hormones in the body. So what about testosterone? Testosterone and growth hormone have both been studied as a response to training. I don't have the study handy to link. Anyone who wants to find it can find it. I hate it when you guys do that. I've gotten a strike before for linking studies. I'm not big on it. Anyone who cares enough who's going to take the time to actually read the study can go to Google and type testosterone or hormones post-workout meta-analysis into Google and find all of it. If you can't take 10 seconds to do that, I promise you're not going to spend 2 hours reading the data. So who cares? So I'll have this video up a month from now, so I'm not even going to remember what we're looking for to even find a way to post you the link. So what does the data actually say? What does the data actually say? that testosterone and growth hormones, that the amounts that you produce at the end of a workout or during a workout, has zero correlation with the amount of muscle you gain. And this is when it's been looked at over time. We're talking about where athletes and people have been tested for blood serum levels of these things at the end of a workout, and then their muscle growth plotted over 8 or 12 weeks. They have found through meta-analysis that there is zero correlation. In other words, how much your testosterone or growth hormone goes up or down as a response to training has no measurable impact. None on your muscle growth. Furthermore, let's be realistic here, most of the guys at his gym are on androgens. They're not producing any testosterone anyways. So even if the levels drop, your production drops as a result of training for a completely natural person, and even if it mattered, which it doesn't, when people are on synthetic stuff, that would be completely irrelevant. It would be completely and utterly irrelevant, because theirs can't drop. Okay, you cannot drop your testosterone levels through training or any other factor when you're putting it in synthetically. You don't have the ability to do so. The only thing that will change it will be how much they put into their body, not their lifestyle or activity. That will have zero impact when you're not producing it. So what about the cortisol thing? Well, the opposite's been found to be true. So what? Cortisol is the one hormone that the production of has been found to have some impact, or at least some correlation with muscle growth. And it's been found in meta-analysis that people who have higher cortisol levels at the end of a training session tend to gain more muscle. Now, correlation and causation. There's a very significant correlation there. Very significant correlation. Doesn't mean the cortisol is causing muscle growth. We can create a hypothesis where it will. What would that hypothesis be? The body reaching homeostasis. If you create a very large catabolic response in the body, but you're supplying everything the body needs for an anabolic response, food, rest, everything else, that you're going to push harder the other direction. Your body's going to push harder to reach back for homeostasis. Okay, so we would have the pendulum hypothesis of that. The pendulum will swing harder the other direction during recovery. In which case, the cortisol itself would produce an anabolic response as it rebalances. Because again, the elevated cortisol is causing a pendulum effect. But then we're dealing with a hormone hypothesis for hypertrophy. That's one hypothesis. I don't know that I buy that one. I don't know that that's the simplest answer, because when we don't have good data on something to prove causation, we have correlation. And usually, we need to look at Occam's razor. What's the most simple explanation that makes sense? Well, the most simple explanation is people who train harder with more volume and more workload are going to have more cortisol as a result of their training. Okay? In other words, the harder you train, and harder not meaning what you perceive as hard, harder meaning how many reps and sets did you do with how much weight, how many quality reps, how many sets did you take to failure, close to failure, what was your tonnage looking like, what was your work density looking like. Not just that you perceived it as hard, like how hard was it actually on your body and muscles and system. Okay. In other words, people who train harder are going to tend to produce more cortisol because there's a larger catabolic response to that. You've inflicted more stress on your body, therefore stress hormones are going to be elevated. The general rule, I think most of us realize from observation, that people who train harder usually get better results. Okay, in that case, we're dealing with purely correlation. The cortisol itself, in that case, is just a side effect. It's not the cause. It's correlated because cortisol goes up when you train harder, and you tend to make better gains when you train harder. They're both after effects of the hard training. That would be, I believe, the more likely hypothesis, but I wouldn't throw out the other one. I wouldn't throw it out completely. So when we're dealing with this and we're talking about, well, limiting whatever training time because we're concerned with transient fluctuations in testosterone and cortisol, that's just not based on what we have seen in human studies of athletes, at least not modern studies. I wouldn't worry about it. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.